Hi, and welcome back to Citra Lab. If there is one thing in common across all of the interventions that we have conducted and supported over the years, it is the fact that they have all been social by nature. And the fact that we have a human social aspect to things, it makes them complex, but fortunately, there is a growing body of research that can help us understand how behavior spreads and how change happens. And to explore these topics with us, we are thrilled to have researcher and author Professor Damon Centolan with us today. And thank you for taking the time, Professor.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. To get started, I think it might be interesting to hear a little bit about your background. Could you tell us a bit about your research background and the field of research that you operate in?
Sure. Well, I did my PhD at a time when there was growing interest in network science, but it wasn't clear what field that interest would land in. So I was trained in physics and computer science and also in the sociology department. And at that time, it was sort of open season on a set of problems that no one really knew whether they were going to ultimately be meaningful for social change or social networks, or for understanding protein folding and molecular biology, or understanding things like power grids. And so there's a tremendous amount of interdisciplinary excitement, and that was a very fun time to be in grad school too, because I learned so many different methods from so many different fields that I was able to apply to my thinking about social change strategies and analytic techniques that just had never been brought to that field before. And one of my ambitions was to see whether the models and the theories that we've had of change, and people in sociology and social science, political science, have developed models of collective action and civic uprisings and protests for 50 years. But the challenge has always been that there were no good data to test those models against, because you literally have to show up at a protest with a pencil and paper and try to count everyone and see if you could somehow generate a time series from that, which is basically impossible. And of course, we started having all of these amazing data from the social world online that could allow us to track some of these activities. One of the big questions became, well, is reporting of online data the same thing as people showing up at a protest? And can you accurately capture like the real aspects of things like the civil rights movement, or more recently things like Black Lives Matter, just from a digital record that doesn't actually count people in the streets, it just counts activity online? And so my solution to that challenge was to say, well, what if we could build experiments where we tried to capture the behaviors that people were adopting, and instead of doing experiments in the way that traditional economics had done them, where essentially you say, okay, I've got this model called the prisoner's dilemma. What I'm going to do is give people the rules of the model and see how they play that game. The challenge there is that instead of using the model to study real life, you're basically taking people out of real life and putting them into your model, right? So you're studying the prisoner's dilemma game instead of studying the thing that the prisoner's dilemma game is meant to represent, right? Whether that's a corporate competition or whether it's people playing on a team together. And so my ambition was to move beyond that concept of experimentation to a world in which I could look at large-scale social change in a natural environment, just watch it unfold, but simultaneously be able to measure what the network influences were in the background. So we would know what real behavior was, and we would know how the network influences controlled it. And one of the sort of ready access points for that was looking at health behavior. And what was so interesting at that time, which is kind of early web stuff, was that people started uploading their incredibly personal and private and like legally protected health data online voluntarily and sharing it with the world, which is also a behavior that no one would have expected. And what wound up happening was people started just doing an end run around professional medicine and started realizing that for a lot of the conditions, particularly rare diseases, there wasn't a lot of good knowledge in medicine, because medicine relies on volumes of data to make good conclusions. It's largely statistical. And so if you have a rare disease, by definition, there aren't volumes of data on it. So finding other people that have that same rare disease and figuring out what worked for them is actually incredibly valuable. It's a source of social capital that just hadn't been there before. And so the digital space became this weirdly influential environment for people with various health conditions to find other people and then to take advice from them. People would stop medications or leave their physician or start medications or join randomized trials based on the advice of people around them on the internet. And so that raises the natural question of, okay, we've got a process of real social influence. And what is the structure of that process? And how do those connections affect whether or not we see popularity of a certain medication spreading for these communities, right? And real health behavior change. Even in less dire settings, like people just deciding to exercise or change their diet, how does that really happen? Because we've had theories, like I said, for half a century. And so what I was able to do was to build an online community that had the texture and the verisimilitude of a product. It was just a world people could come sign up. They weren't paid. It wasn't, like the kind of experiments you read about in old-fashioned economic journals where we give a bunch of undergrads $20 and they came and played a game for us. And it's like, all right, well, it's hard to know what you're really studying at that point. You're studying undergrads playing a game. Is that the same thing as the real tensions between the U.S. and the USSR trying to negotiate an arms treaty, right? It's like, well, that's using the same model to describe these things. Whereas what I want to say, okay, I'm interested in this sort of influential process of people getting other people to adopt something that's costly, that's difficult, that has real risks associated with it, and that's way outside the kind of norms of like medical authority, of like experts. It's just regular people. How does that process work? And so I was able to build a community with several thousand people who were just, people who showed up to meet other people to make some health decisions. And then what was experimental about it was I changed the network structure among the community members in a way that manipulated their pattern of contacts. And I created 12 of these independent communities so I could compare how different manipulations of their networks affected whether or not behavior changes spread through these communities. And I spent a couple of years beforehand developing a theory that helped to explain how this would happen. But to me, this was the beginning of a new era of social science, and really frames like everything I've done since. Because it means that when we develop theories of social change and we develop sort of big models, and that's I'm sure what we'll talk about today, is like what these big theories are and why they matter, that we are now for the first time in a position where we are kind of like physics and biology, where we can run large scale experiments on how social change happens. And that's been, I would say, for the last decade, the mainstay of what's kept this work exciting for me.
I recently read the book of yours released in 2021 titled Change, which I think is one of the biggest releases that you have done so far. And it describes a lot of your work that you have done with data, and that work exposes a lot of kind of misconceptions and false intuitions that people carry about how behavior changes and how innovation spreads. What would you consider to be some of the kind of key misconceptions and myths that people have regarding their change thinking compared to your research?
Yeah, I would say that the big concepts that we've been handed down from some recent titles, some popular titles, but also work that goes back to the early beginnings of sociology and social networks in the 1940s and 50s, is we sort of all believe that ideas, behaviors, information, change all spread like virally, right? That's one concept of virality. And we have that, infusing a lot of our thinking. And the writer, Malcolm Gladwell, actually wrote a book, as a journalist, stating this explicitly, like everything spreads like an epidemic. And then from that, you get some, implications. And one is, in epidemics, you have people who are very well connected. They're very social. And if that person gets the measles or that person gets COVID, then they're going to infect a lot of other people. So these super spreaders. So there's a natural analogy to social life. We're like, oh, there are people who know a lot of people. And if they adopt something, then maybe it's just like a disease where then they tell a lot of people and they adopt it. And then now we call them influencers. So these are parallel concepts that all stem from this idea of using basically a virus model or a viral model of epidemics, and then using that as an explanation for how social change happens. And that's kind of where my work started, was thinking about whether that is actually true, because we've got a lot of stories that seem to say that that's how social change and behavior change works. But when you start looking at the data from things like, the big events like the civil rights movement, the sociologists who were studying that, back in the 80s, were finding results that didn't quite fit with that kind of viral epidemic model. But the data weren't clear enough, and they didn't have a strong enough theory that would explain why there was a difference. So there was just basically a set of inconsistent stories. There was like a popular story that everything is viral, and then there were these studies that were really careful and very good, saying like, well, maybe there's a network effect, but it's not a viral network effect. Something else is happening here. And so where I got into this was to really start investigating, well, is there really a tension here? Is there a puzzle that explains why we're getting kind of two sets of results? And what I found out essentially is that when we're looking at the spread of behavior, we really shouldn't think about it the same way as a virus. And here's a really good way of sort of helping make sense of that. When you think about networks, the classic way we talk about networks is basically as these like pipes, these transmission conduits. And so we say, all right, if I have COVID, and we know if I'm unmasked and we're talking in close proximity in a small space, I'm spreading, the infection to you, then the connection between us, when we do the kind of contact tracing to sort of reverse engineer the spread of COVID, we say, okay, the contact between me and you, where I spread COVID to you, is considered like a link in a disease diffusion network. And so that connection is like basically a pipe as a transmission vehicle. And then once you're infected, we look at all the people have had close contact with, and these are more links, which we think of as more pipes out to other people. And so basically each contact is a transmission. And we keep iterating through that like series and series of contacts, and we get this sort of massive web of society, and we can trace how the disease spreads through all these different links. So when we've tried to map that model, which is the model of virus spreading, onto behavior change and social movements, the problem we encounter is that compare the spread of COVID to the spread of face masks, right? Particularly in the US, at the very beginning of the pandemic, what wound up happening was some people would wear face masks, and other people would, instead of just seeing someone adopt it and therefore they adopted it, like with the disease, where you basically had no choice. If you came into contact, you got it. People would do the opposite. They'd see someone adopt it and they'd identify that person as politically different from them. And in the US, it became really stratified between like Republicans and Democrats, where if you saw someone wearing a face mask, it was almost a signal of their economic status, their political beliefs. It was really striking. And so someone on the opposite side of that social divide would then use that as a reason not to wear face masks. And so it's not just that they were uncomfortable or didn't want to wear them or didn't think there was risk. It was actually like an oppositional political statement to not wear a face mask. And so that really tells us that like the social diffusion of something like wearing face masks behaves very differently than the diffusion of the virus. And so that kind of pulls apart these dynamics where viral dynamics behave in what I refer to as a simple contagion, which means basically contact is transmission. And that's like basically saying every relationship is a pipe. And so it just keeps spreading from person to person. Whereas with social change and behavior, you're not just coming into contact with things, you're also evaluating who you're coming into contact with. And importantly, you're thinking about all the other people you know and whether they've adopted this thing. Now, again, with COVID, it doesn't make a difference. If you come into contact with someone with COVID, it doesn't matter how many healthy people you know, that one contact is going to infect you. But if you come into contact with someone wearing a face mask and everyone else you know doesn't wear face masks, then those people who haven't adopted are influential, even though they're not there and they're not explicitly trying to influence you. They're in this implicit series of countervailing influences that prevent you from adopting this new innovation that's just come into contact with. And so that is like a stark difference between a simple viral model and what's going on with behavior change, which I refer to as complex contagion. And the real key thing with complex contagion is that in this sense, networks aren't just these pipes, they're actually prisms. Who you're connected to and who they're connected to, and the social meaningfulness of those connections actually kind of refracts and shapes and colors the information you see and helps you to make a decision that can sometimes be the exact opposite of adoption. You come into contact and it actually makes you less likely to adopt the thing in the future. And so complex contagion really requires that we look at like this complex web of social networks interactions in a very different way in the traditional disease model, where every single link is just basically a transmission vehicle. In these cases, links can be vehicles, links can be sources of opposition. And then now that's allowed me to develop a more comprehensive theory that explains when links operate in a way that reinforces adoption and when social ties operate in a way that prevents adoption. And this gave rise to essentially a large theory of simple and complex contagion that allowed me to then make predictions about things like the spread of the civil rights movement and look back at the data and make sure that the way that this model worked actually did correspond to that, versus things like the spread of gossip on social media. You can see the spread of gossip spreads just like a simple contagion, and the spread of joining support for same-sex marriage is something that spread like a complex contagion and required lots of social reinforcement before people would show support, because there's some social risk involved. You're supporting a movement that other people oppose, and you want to be sure that other people find this movement legitimate and credible before you show your support for it. So anytime there's like a social risk involved, then the behavior spread tends to be complex, and the networks that support it tend to look very different than the networks that spread viruses.
There are a lot of things to
I hit a lot of points.
Tackle here. Now you mentioned social meaningfulness, then you mentioned kind of political difference, and that simple and complex contagious, they are very different from one another. And then you mentioned also kind of the social reinforcement that people need. One of the key elements that struck me when I was reading your material is the fact that there's the idea in simple contagion that we want to spread our ideas far and wide and reach as many people as possible. But that's not necessarily a good tactic if we want to spread behavior change. We also need quite a bit of redundancy in the network as well, right?
Yeah, and the redundancy is one of the key concepts I focus on. And that's because of really the irony, which is that when you think about the spread of like a virus or the spread of a new piece of information or trying to get the word of mouth about your product out there, redundancy is the enemy. You don't want the people talking to the same people. You want every tie to link to new people, to new people, to new people. You want that kind of spreading as many people as fast as possible. And what's so interesting in the kinds of cases I was able to really talk about in detail in the book are cases where that strategy, it doesn't just fail for complex contagions. It like backfires with surprising effect. Where, one of my favorite examples is Google Glass, where Google, it's this very smart company and has a lot of money to put behind its innovations. And so when it launched Glass, it did the standard thing, right? It said, okay, we're going to assume this is we're going to generate viral spread of our new cyborg technology. I don't know if you remember, but Glass were these sort of cyborg eyewear that you could browse the web while you're talking to people, or even surveil the visual environment and record it while you were just sort of walking around the park. And Google's idea was to say, okay, we want to use stickiness. We're going to make this product really, memorable and easy to use. And that actually maps onto the viral concept of like a highly infectious disease, right? That's where stickiness comes from, is thinking about what makes a virus, spread really, like why does measles spread so effectively? And it's like, well, because you get it and it just grabs on, it doesn't let go. And so it doesn't take like a very large exposure to infect you. And so the idea of stickiness is like, okay, let's make a product like that. It'll just grab you and it won't let go. We'll make it memorable. We'll make it catchy. We'll make it easy to talk about, right? All those things that we talk about in the marketing space, which work for simple contagions, right? But so for Google Glass, what you have to take into account is also existing social norms. So Google, in addition to using the kind of stickiness strategy, they also use the influencer strategy, where they say, we're going to get some sort of high profile Silicon Valley people who can afford $1,500 eyeglasses and ask them to, we're going to give them, these glasses and ask them to wear them publicly and kind of show off. And these are people everyone wants to be like. Everyone's aspiring to be those people. So they're going to be the big influencers in the Silicon Valley community, and everyone's going to imitate them, and our product's going to take off, and then it's going to go viral, right? That was the strategy. What wound up happening was something that no one but a sociologist would anticipate, which was that this bizarre social phenomenon called social norms, where what Glass did was that you were talking to someone and you were browsing the web while you were talking to them. And culturally and socially, that felt like really rude and inappropriate to people. And what was worse is that you might be recording them without them knowing it. And that became something that really raised people's hackles in terms of violations of privacy. And so that was just something that Google just never anticipated because they didn't think about their product as anything in the social norm space. They just thought about it in the space of like marketing technology. And so what wound up happening was this, this emergent culture war, which was beneath the surface, and there may have been latent aspects of it, but it just certainly didn't exist the way that Google Glass surfaced it, which was that signs started showing up in cafes and restaurants that said, if you're wearing glass, not welcome. Like you couldn't come in if you were wearing this product, which is like, I've never heard of that before. And then a term was coined, which was glasshole, which was a way of describing people who would wear this product. Now think of this in the context of the influencer model, where the influencer model is that the person who wears a product is very prominent in society and has all these features that you want to emulate. And by wearing this product, you want to be like them. And so aspirationally, you adopt the product, right? Like someone who wears an expensive wristwatch or drives a beautiful sports car, that kind of thing. And that's what Google was trying to exploit. But what happened here was that the social norm pushback was so strong that the meaningfulness of, these people are special and different turned from a positive into a negative, where these people are special and different because they're all glass holes and we don't want to be anything like them. In fact, we don't want them to even come near us, right? And so the ultimate result was that not only was the product line canceled, I mean, glass just disappeared and, Google was embarrassed about it, but actually the company reputation was hurt, right? Because they did in fact make glass sticky. Everyone remembers it, everyone talks about it, but they talk about it as a colossal failure, right? And so this is where stickiness backfires and influencers backfires, and trying to use the viral model in a context where social norms are what matter can really hurt an initiative and actually salt the earth for future attempts. And so I think there are lots of really valuable lessons to take from these situations. And this is where having an understanding of the dynamics, this sort of social network dynamics of simple and complex contagions, helps us to like really understand and explain why these things happen, and then to anticipate these kinds of things in the future and not make the same mistakes.
At the moment, our work focuses on participation and democracy. And the interventions that we are conducting, they are kind of high risk. They try to do something completely new, and there's a lot of risk involved. And what the interventions I'm aiming for is a wide range of adoption. So looking at the stuff that we have been discussing, would it be a wise strategy to focus more on the peripheral actors of the networks that we want to influence, or how should people kind of approach these kind of situations?
Yeah, this is one of the topics I focus on in the book, and there's actually some very interesting developments on this work that I published right after the book. So the way I frame it in the discussion is to say, look, the way that we typically visualize and conceptualize social networks is that the very highly connected people, the people with lots of ties, outgoing, think of stars on social media or celebrities, are the people who we think of as influencers because they are seen by so many people. And the thing to take into account is that those people at the quote unquote center of the network can certainly spread something simple that everyone already kind of understands, like a new brand of coconut water, whatever it is. But the thing to take into account about someone who's so highly connected is that when you're seen by a lot of people, you're also evaluated by a lot of people and judged and commented on by a lot of people. And so the result is that people who are highly connected also tend to be very reluctant to adopt anything that goes against the social norms of the people who are watching them. So they're actually really constrained when it comes to initiating new political ideas, new social movements, or culture change in the culture more broadly, or within organizations. And so as a result of that, they tend to be much more conservative in the things that they try to spread, only because that maintains their status as an influencer. What winds up happening, if those people who are viewed as having so much power because they have so many ties, try to do something that really goes against the norms and expectations of their community, what winds up happening is that they're no longer viewed as an influencer. So they lose all of that status that they prize so much. A great example of this was around the 2020 election in the US. So Fox News originally reported, accurately that Trump had lost and Biden had won and so forth. And they were promoting that fact, but they were just kind of reporting the news. And they basically started losing their viewership to more extreme right-wing outlets who started talking about fraud and conspiracies. And so the Fox News anchors, who we think of as like highly influential, social leaders in the conservative space, there are a series of meetings that were recorded, and those recordings have now been released, where basically they're at a panic. They're like, we're losing our viewership because they don't want to hear what we have to say. So then they changed the story on Fox News to start talking about election fraud and conspiracy in the 2020 election in response to the norms and expectations of their viewing community, right? And so this is a beautiful example of like the quote unquote influencers actually not saying what they think and not saying what they believe, but actually saying something that would be simple contagion for their viewing audience. And so the question is, well, okay, where does change come from then? Everything just gets repeated and regurgitated and everything's familiar. Well, people in the periphery are much less connected. And so they have fewer outgoing ties, but they also have fewer incoming ties constraining them. And more importantly, those ties tend to be a little bit more clustered, more reinforcing in their structures. So 2, 3, 4 people together can coordinate their action on several, common neighbors, and they can coordinate their action. And so whereas the influencers network looks like a fireworks explosion, just going in all directions, they also have all those incoming ties, pressuring them to sort of stay within the social norms. They don't really have much support. It's just them. But if you look at the periphery of the network, it's much more like something like a fishing net, like lots of little triangles connected together in a web. And so what that means is if you get a cluster of people supporting a view that's unpopular, they can reinforce and support each other in maintaining that view, and then also reinforce and convince people near them that they share in common to adopt that view. And it seems like a less efficient way of getting change off the ground, right? You think intuitively, why not start in the center? We can reach so many people so quickly. Well, you just have to take into account that all of those people are countervailing influences, and they all have countervailing influences. And so there's just this tremendous pressure to not change. Whereas in the periphery, once you get a little bit of a cluster going, that can spread more effectively from neighbor to neighbor to neighbor. And very soon, much surprisingly fast, you can get a critical mass that actually takes over the entire network and then reaches the center. By that time, enough people have adopted in the periphery that the people who are following the center actually give the person in the middle permission to adopt this new thing, and then it spreads. And this is why almost always when you see the spread of things like support for same-sex marriage or even adoption of Arab Spring and engagement in Black Lives Matter, you always see that the people who are most highly connected adopt later. And it's always the people in the periphery who initiate these processes. And that is a direct result of the complexity of that diffusion process.
Thanks again for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure of mine.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.